On today's show, we're going to have another lesson in Kansas history, and wait till you hear this one. We're going to learn about an obscure public health law called Chapter 205. It's going to rile you up. Coming up next on Inspire. Inspire is sponsored by Kansas Furniture Mart, using furniture to inspire conversation. And by the Blanche Bryden Foundation. Hello, thank you for joining us for Inspire. I'm pleased to be here with the beautiful Amber Dickinson and Leslie Florange, and two more beauties coming up.
Today we're going to discuss Chapter 205, a World War I era health law that many Kansans have never heard of.
Joining us today via Zoom are Nichole Perry, author of Policing Sex in the Sunflower State, which tells the story of the controversial law. And we welcome back one of our favorite history professors, Kerry Wynn of Washburn University. Thank you so much for joining us on Inspire. So we got to just jump right in because we've got a lot to talk about today. So Nichole, please tell us about your book, Policing Sex in the Sunflower State.
Yeah, so this law, Chapter 205, in itself was kind of boring. It was just a law that gave the Board of Health the power to detain people for disease, to quarantine people. Where it got interesting was how it was implemented. Women, but not men, were detained for having syphilis and gonorrhea. So between World War I and World War II, over 5,000 women were sent to a prison in Lansing, Kansas. They didn't commit any crime. They just had syphilis or gonorrhea. And while a few men were detained right after the law was passed, there were a couple hundred. After World War I was over, it really kind of hardly any men. They really stopped detaining men. So it was this very gendered policy where the state was imprisoning women just for having a disease.
And this is crazy because oftentimes they didn't really have the disease. They hadn't really gone through an examination. They just wanted to get rid of them in some cases. And there's all ages. I mean, going down to like a 14-year-old.
Yeah, actually even younger than that. So this institution where they were sent was called the Kansas State Industrial Farm for Women in Lansing. And women who had babies could actually take their babies with them. So there were, toddlers and babies there. There were also young girls who were sent there. So girls as young as like 9 or 10 who had a disease and were sent there. So it was a whole range of people. The policy was really focused on there was a lot of kind of national angst about young women's sexuality and trying to control young women's sexual behaviors, and this was kind of one response to that. So most of the women were detained were in their teens and 20s, was kind of the largest segment of the population there.
So who put this law into place in the first place? So, I mean, if you think about that time, right, there was prohibition, there was people trying to stop marijuana. We had all these control freaks back then, right? So who was it that was saying, let's put this law into place in the first place?
Yeah, so it kind of came about during World War I, and it was very much related to the military. This is before we had antibiotics. So syphilis and gonorrhea weren't really things that we could cure, and they were some of the leading reasons why men had to miss active military duty. And so as the United States was gearing up to get into war, nationally, officials considered whether they wanted to do something like, give out condoms to soldiers. But instead, they decided on this elaborate plan to try to convince soldiers not to have sex. And then when that didn't work, they were like, let's just round up all the women around the camps. And So this actually happened nationally, that women were, especially around military bases, were detained during World War I. But Kansas was kind of unique in that we just kept going for it, and we kept detaining women between the world wars. So we were a little more enthusiastic, I guess, in Kansas than some other places.
How were these women identified? And furthermore, how were they then rounded up and brought to this facility?
Yeah, so there were various ways that people came to be, like how authorities found out. So sometimes people would turn them in, a family member or just somebody who knew that they had a disease. In some cases, it was actually a woman's husband, because men weren't detained under this. Like sometimes men would, cheat on their wife, bring home a disease, and then they'd get in a fight and he would turn her in and she'd have to be sent to prison because of this. So some women were turned in. Other women were just detained and, they might be arrested for prohibition or just being in the wrong place or whatever. So authorities would just routinely test all women that they came in contact with for these diseases. So even if they weren't convicted for the other offense, they might be sent to this prison because of their disease. And 20% of the women actually volunteered to go there because they couldn't afford treatment anywhere else. And that's kind of another part of the really sad story, was that there weren't a lot of public health clinics. And so some women that was the only way they could get care.
Wow. And okay, now I read that a lot of this was they would go and kind of stake out a dance hall and just round the women up there.
Yeah, so there were raids that authorities would do. So it could be around dance halls, or a lot of like liquor raids were another thing, because as you mentioned, this is during Prohibition. And so it's kind of like you have these routine, if the police were kind of concentrating on a certain area that they were trying to clean up or whatever, it would have really different consequences for women versus men. Because if they didn't get caught doing anything illegal, they would be let go, as they should have been. But the women, they would take them all and go test them for disease. So you might end up, just by being in the wrong place, being sent to this farm.
So how did you even come across this chapter 205, and what precipitated you deciding to write a book?
Yeah, so I was in graduate school, and I was looking for topics to do research on, and I was trying to learn a little bit about prostitution in the 20s and 30s in this area. And I just came across a website on the State Historical Society's website where they mentioned this. And I was like, I had never heard of this before. This is really interesting. I'm from Kansas, and I was like, I'm really into women's history. Like, how did I not know this? So then I kind of just kept digging and digging, and it just got more and more interesting, I think, as I looked into it more, because at first I thought that all the women were going to be prostitutes, because that was kind of how it was originally talked about. And a lot of the official government documents talk about these women as being like in dire need of moral reform and all these things. But when you actually, there's a set of really interesting inmate interviews, and when you hear the women's perspective, many of them didn't really break any of the moral rules. Some of them did. Some of them were having a great time, but other ones were really not. Like, a lot of the women were married, and they would have been able to contract syphilis or gonorrhea in a perfectly respectable way, I guess. And they still came under the, they still ended up in this prison.
So in the intake interviews, there's this phrasing where they tell these women that you've broken the law of chastity. So who created the idea of the law of chastity? I bet I have some ideas, but could you offer some perspective on who created this idea that somehow, because women were exercising their sexuality, that they were in violation of this established moral code?
Yeah. The questions on the interview form are so
insane.
Like, it says, at what age did you first break the law of chastity, and what was the cause of your moral downfall? And kind of the interesting piece about this is they actually used the same form for the women who were detained under Chapter 205 and for the women who were there for any other offense. So if you were there for theft or murder, you would have answered those same questions. And that kind of shows that really close connection that a lot of people had between women's criminality and sexuality. Like, they were very much tied together in ways that they weren't for men.
All right, Nikki and Kerry, we're going to get you in here as well. And are you a little riled up? Well, we're going to learn more about this in the Sunflower State and what's going on with venereal disease and more on Chapter 205. Please stay with us.
Today we're going to be talking about indoor plants that are wonderful selections for your office. I don't think many people have houseplants in their office, and you absolutely should. They have some of the same benefits as in your home, reducing air pollutants and dust mites and all those things that we don't want out of the air, but they have some additional benefits in the office. Offices that have houseplants can actually decrease employee sick time by about 14% and increase productivity by about 30%. If you have plants in your individual office while you're working on your computer, it can actually increase the amount of time that you want to sit there focused on those computer tasks. Just by having them around us, it makes us a little bit happier and more content being at work. So who doesn't want that? These plants are all wonderful selections for our office. Many of our offices have fluorescent lights, and some have small windows or no windows at all, so all of these can tolerate low light conditions. The first plant I want to talk about is Rattlesnake Calithia. This is a little bit of a different Calithia. It's got a different leaf shape, and it has this wonderful dark purple underside with a light green leaf that has this really nice glossy dark green pattern on it. So it's a very striking plant to have in your office. Another thing that I love about the Calithia is they do fold up and unfold during the day, and sometimes the rustle of the leaves, that little bit of movement, is my indication that I've been sitting in my desk too long and I need to get up. So just having plants around us can be that nice reminder that we too are living and need to be moving. Spider plant, or airplane plant as some know it, is another great choice for the office. It really propagates very readily. It will shoot off babies as soon as it gets to be just a little bit bigger than what this plant is. So it's a great plant that you can actually share around the office, share with your coworkers. You can take those babies, the small plants, and just set them on top of soil. It needs a little bit of water, not a lot, and you can mostly neglect it. And similar to some of these other plants, it can do very well under just fluorescent lighting without a window. ZZ palm can absolutely tolerate just fluorescent lighting, but it is just going to sit there. It doesn't grow very fast. It can sometimes be months before you see it grow or change at all, and it has this kind of glossy, waxy leaf that sometimes makes people think that it's a fake plant. But it isn't a fake plant. It's very much alive and gives you the same benefits as all the others. It just is a little bit of a slow grower. Snake plant is another lovely one. The variegated versions of snake plant are much more common. I like this because it's a little more compact and has that nice dark green leaf to it. Again, it's going to be very low water. A couple months in between watering is the best practice. But if you start to see that leaf pucker up a little bit, that's a good indication that it does need to be watered. And then finally, many of us have Pothos in our office. It's probably the one that I see the most, but it's just the typical golden Pothos. And there are so many better varieties and colors that you can add to your office that give that a little bit of interest. So this is actually a marble queen. It's a green with a white on top. There's also a snow queen that's more of a white base with green. And then there's also a neon Pothos, which is a really bright lime green, which can be a lot of fun for your office. No matter what plant you select, make sure that you're selecting a plant that's appropriate for the office you have, and pay attention to the cultural requirements, the water and moisture that it needs, and your plants will be happy, and in return you'll be a more productive, happier worker as well.
We're back with our guests, author Nichole Perry and Professor Kerry Wynn. So Professor Wynn, should we be shocked by how differently men and women were treated under this law?
That's a really hard question to answer. I would say, yes, I would hope we were shocked, but really, if you know a lot about U.S. history in this time period, to treat men and women differently under this law is really conversant with the rest of the body of laws in the United States in many ways, even in areas that aren't directly about the policing of sexuality. Men and women were often treated very, very differently under laws. For example, one of the ways you can see this most is for men and women when they were married, their legal rights changed a great deal or differed a great deal from each other. So in the time period between 1907 and 1922, for example, a woman could lose her citizenship in the United States if she married a man who was not a citizen of the US. That didn't happen for a man. So there were a lot of double standards in the law at the time.
I have to ask, was there any kind of situation where there were more of one race than another going into these camps and being affected by this Chapter 205?
Women of color were overrepresented among the women who were detained, and some of that has to go with how the law was implemented. So if you think about police officers raiding a dance hall or whatever, they were more likely to raid certain parts of town than others. Part of the way that the law was written was there was a lot of discretion given to a local health officer to decide whether a woman was respectable enough to be trusted to get treatment on their own. So it wasn't that anybody who had a disease was sent there. It was women who were sent there who they didn't think could be trusted to not have sex with anyone, essentially. So racism played into that. And then also poor women were a lot more likely to go because, when you think about the fact that a lot of women volunteered to go there. There was one thing I read that said that a treatment for a year of syphilis was out of the price range of 80% of the U.S. population at the time. So it was very expensive to get care, and so that could lead to some women, that really being their only option.
But there were 9-year-olds who were sent to these camps. I mean, how could they do such a thing to a child?
I think sort of the bigger issue when I was reading through these transcripts is they continually refer to these children as women. And I think that it's this like hypersexualization of children is extraordinarily problematic. And so I think, and please tell me if I'm missing the mark here, but it seems to me that they were evaluating the sexuality, the potential sexuality of a child as opposed to the reality, and that this is a child. Is that sort of what the mentality was?
Yeah, I think so. And I think part of this too is this is during the time of eugenics in the United States. And we see a growth in these types of institutions that are supposed to be reforming young women and kids. And there was kind of this idea, this like strong faith in social science, that if we just applied social science to people, we could fix all these problems and prevent all these degenerate groups from doing whatever they were going to do that the people in charge didn't think was proper. And so I think there was definitely this emphasis on intervening in the lives of young women before they went all the way down the road to prostitution. And so you're definitely right that there are, they'll talk about how these women need moral reform and stuff, and then they don't mention the fact that, the 9-year-old was sexually abused by their uncle, and that's why they were there. And
Right.
Yes.
It's very disturbing accounts with these kids.
It seems crazy to me. Was there backlash to this at the time from anyone?
I wish I knew more about this. And one piece of it is I'm not sure how aware people were of what was happening. There was a backlash. The element of children being at the farm, I think, was the piece that I found the most backlash against. So there was a report written in 1933 where a government board evaluated a lot of state institutions, and they were definitely saying they didn't think kids should be going to this prison.
And this was still going on up until the 40s, correct?
Things changed a lot in World War II. As the United States entered into war, they kind of started going down the same path where the rate of women being detained under Chapter 205 started to go up. But then penicillin is just a total game changer. And all of a sudden, these diseases are things that are pretty easy to treat. And so the number of women being detained goes down really fast. But there are a couple women as late as the 1950s who are being detained under this law.
And Kerry, we talked about the disparities about how the law affects men and women. Why is it important for the young men and women of today to realize the history, all this that has taken place?
That's a really good question. I think that it is a part, we don't necessarily always talk about laws like Chapter 205, and that it's important to know that those kind of discriminatory laws existed, not even necessarily on their face, but in practice, right? It's important to know the way in which laws were implemented and the history of that, because I don't necessarily think we are free from laws that do that today, right? So you have to be able to recognize it. And I think that there are also generations of individuals who fought against these laws and fought pretty courageously against them. And so that's a tradition that is worth keeping in mind.
So we have this sort of long-standing tradition in this country of taking issues like mental health issues or drug issues and punishing them with prison time. Does this law fall into that same kind of the punitive way that we address what we've decided are moral concerns in our society? Would you classify this sort of in that same vein?
I would think so. Even at the time, there are people who recognize that this is not necessarily the way you cure venereal disease. Venereal disease was a public health question and problem, and many women wanted treatment for venereal disease. But to think that you might have to be incarcerated to get that treatment is not a terrific public health strategy, right? And even at the time, in 1919, Frances Storrs Johnson, who was an OBGYN who was from Kansas, spoke at an international conference, and she said, compulsory detention for treatment of venereal disease is not the way to cure venereal disease. You have to treat men as well as women. There are two people involved in this scenario at least, and if you want to stop transmission, there are much better ways to do it than forcing women into prison, which happened in many cases throughout the world.
And so what was going on in these prisons, by the way? I mean, were they doing laundry? Were they doing something to give back to society, quote unquote? What was their role while being incarcerated? And was there a certain length of time that women had to stay in these prisons?
Nikki can speak pretty specifically about the Kansas industrial farm, but very often in many facilities throughout the world, they're providing for their own care. They're actually running the farm. So they're doing all the labor that's involved in that while they're staying and while they're getting treatment. And Nikki, you want to say more?
Yeah, so there was this movement to change the way that women's prisons worked during this period, and the Kansas State Industrial Farm for Women was actually a model that other people from across the country came to visit, because the women weren't behind bars. They were, especially in the earlier period, they were, walking around. It was out in the country. They took care of chickens. They grew all their own food. So in some ways, it wasn't like what we think about with prison, but they weren't free to leave either. And there are definitely, as time went on, as you get further into the 1920s and 30s, there were more bars added, and it started to feel a little more institutional, I would say. But the idea was that these women were supposed to be there to be morally cured. And there was language in the Board of Health documents that said, it's not always recognized as something more than just a drug is needed to treat venereal disease, and implying that these 9-year-old girls and these women who got disease from their husbands were at moral fault. And so there was a lot of this idea that we needed to teach women how to work hard, how to take care of a home, and how to be properly feminine in order to really rehabilitate them. And so they were actually there under an indefinite sentence until they were supposed to be morally cured.
So there's no due process involved in this whatsoever, right?
No, they did not receive a trial.
Yeah. And so really the message this sends is that, because correct me if I'm wrong, in some of these prisons, you've got women that are there for moral concerns right next to people that have committed a true crime. And so the message that this seems to send is that if you don't you don't adhere to this moral standard that someone has just created, that you are equivalent in our society to a genuine criminal. Is that the message that this is sending us? That's horrific.
I think so. And that just the very idea that particular bodies can be policed, right? Or are for policing. And that's one of the things I think also sticks with us as well, right? I mean, the policing and the legacy of policing women's bodies in a way we don't necessarily police men's bodies, both through healthcare or through legislation. That's something that lives on.
Ladies, thank you so much for being with us today. When we come back, we're going to continue our discussion on Chapter 205.
Okay, ladies, just when you think you've heard it all, we learned something about Kansas history, but then this was, in other states as well. I want to start with you because I know you're riled.
You know, I think it's so dangerous, first of all, to create these constructs out of nowhere that we expect women to adhere to. And then when women don't do what we think women should do, we punish them. And it's unbelievable to me. And I look at something like this, which in all reality, what this type of law does is it gives men permission to get rid of women that they don't want to deal with anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's morally reprehensible, and we're doing it still today. I'm so tired of listening to people try to control women in this kind of way. Obviously, we don't have women that we're just rounding up and throwing in prison, but gosh, we're doing things that are pretty close to it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thrilled to know that, you know, women are standing up for themselves more and more. Major corporations are recognizing that they have to treat women equally. We just heard that the soccer teams in the United States, they just got a settlement, although that's not 100% done either. Mm-hmm. But, you know, it's a man's world and we're just living in it. We hope that in the next, 20, 30 years, that's going away. There has to be some equality because women bring more to the table than ever before, and we're only getting better and better and better.
But you look at legislation like they're passing in Texas, where they're basically assigning bounty hunters to go find women who are seeking abortions and turn them in. It has echoes of this to me.
That is unacceptable and just horrible that they would even think to do something like that. The fear that other people have of the strength and the power of women is just totally upsetting. And why would we want to do this to people that are our own citizens? I don't understand it.
Because it's oppression.
Let's go back a little bit. Have you guys been hearing about some of the younger women who want to be treated differently, who want, so now that's kind of, and when you think of all the women who have worked so hard, marched, talked, voted to make things better, and then to hear that maybe some of them kind of liked it how it used to be, how does that make you feel?
You know, I don't ever want to judge someone's opinion, but I think overall that having that mindset for yourself personally and then encouraging legislation that is punitive towards women are two different things. You can think what you want, all you want, and that's your own personal business. But the second that you put a law on the books that punishes women unfairly, or you accept practices in the workplace that treats women differently, or however you're going about discriminating against women, that's the difference, right? The difference between having a personal mindset and causing real damage to fellow women.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to watch this program again, or any KTWU production, go to watch.ktwu.org.
And if you're so inspired to learn more about our guests, find out what's coming up on future shows, and get access to additional content, be sure to visit our website at www.ktwu.org/inspire.
Inspiring women, inspiring historical knowledge, like it or not, inspiring you on KTWU. Thank you for watching. Inspire is sponsored by Kansas Furniture Mart, using furniture to inspire conversation. And by the Blanche Bryden Foundation.